the coolest thing I think that's ever happened in the reef aquarium world. I swear it's the coolest thing in the world, because the Pratt Reef Club now every year gives Aiptasia to students to keep as pets. And at first that seems like an insane, stupid, horrible thing to do. But upon reflection, it's the smartest thing ever.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't kill them and the students get to care for a living thing, right? So how did that come up?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like the chia pet of the marine world.
Kind of, yeah. So TJ, the founder of Reef Club, was cleaning the tanks one day, and because they're tanks, we had some Aiptasia, and I was telling her, we got to kill these things, blah 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 blah. They spread, they're evil, they sting things, they're impossible to get rid of, bad 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 bad. And she was like, okay, I get that, I understand that, but they're kind of cool. And I was like, well, yeah. And then I told her about, the days and even pre-me, the stories Terry Siegel used to tell in the 1970s and 80s when you had a tank filled with Aiptasia and you thought it was like the greatest success of marine reef keeping in history. So I told her those stories, and then she was just thinking for a second in that kind of Pratt student way and said, would one live in a jar? I was like, maybe. I have no idea, I really have no idea. And then she said, can we try it? And I was like, sure, I'm all for that. And that's the other thing, if a kid, has an idea of something they want to experiment with, and this was like a very early version of that, I'm all for supporting that. And we try to give them the resources, and I can talk about some of the other things that have come out of that, but focus on this. So I thought about it for a little bit, and I sat down with TJ and we kind of worked through some stuff, and we came up with like a really, really practical, simplest of systems to try to keep an Aiptasia alive in a jar. And basically we came down to, we needed a set volume of water that came from one of my tanks, so it was mature water. Small piece of live rock to add some bacteria, piece of Chaeto to absorb some nutrients and to provide some oxygenation. And that was it. And then we kind of knew that evaporation was going to be an issue. So we said, all right, we're going to have to make sure that we note where the water level is, and we can't let it evaporate too much or the salinity is going to increase, and that's going to be a problem. And then beyond that, it was like figuring out temperature and light, right? And, as we know, they're pretty hardy. So we kind of experimented around with this one jar in the office and determined that room temperature in most circumstances was just fine. You probably didn't want it on a windowsill because the temperature would be too volatile, either too cold or too warm, depending. And then for lighting, again, pretty variable. So again, not on the windowsill because you'll just get an algae mess as the sunlight comes streaming in. Desk lamp works just fine. And, we just experimented with it, and she took it home, and it lived for a while. And we decided that since I had so many Aiptasias, that we would see how many students were interested in trying this and how many were able to succeed. And we put out a poster and a call for one of our club meetings. Anybody could come. You didn't have to be a club member. All you have to do is bring a jar, and we would provide everything else. And like 60 kids showed up.
The first time.
For the first time.
60.
But it's like a low impact pet.
Yeah, totally. So, and then we kind of coined the phrase, we turn pests into pets, So,
That's great.
Yeah. And so we had this big event, and these 60 kids went off and they sort of did their thing, and we lost track of most of them. We never really know what happened. And then a few of them reported that they died immediately. And some others came back to us with a year later saying, hey, it's still alive. I'm going home for the summer. Can you take care of it? So it's like wildly inconsistent. And we've been doing these now every year since 2014, I think.
What's the most that you've set up in a year?
Most number?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's 60 numbers about it. About every semester, that's pretty much what we come to.
Wow.
Yeah, which is crazy. And students are having really pretty good success with it.
Has
I
anyone, what about longevity? Has anyone like,
I
man, I
think
had
about
this
2 years is the record, as far as I know. Oh, and I
Wow.
actually have a jar here for people who maybe want to see what we're talking. This is I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah,
I
it's
can
doing
see
it.
it.
The Aiptasia up at the top there. Mine there. Now, this is a jar we keep in the writing center. It's larger than the typical jar that most students have, although we suggested. And this year, students tended to bring larger jars, and a larger percentage of them are having success. So it's pretty obvious a larger water volume
Yeah.
is useful. And this one also has some other kinds of macroalgae in it, since we can control it a little better in here. So this is kind of a souped up jar.
Do they do water changes from time to time?
If it's looking really rough, I tell them they can come back here and I will do a water change. And they don't have tanks, so they're not
They
going to
just
mix
bring
all.
the jar to the writing
They
center.
just bring the jar to the writing center. We do a water change for them.
That's so great.
But most don't. Again, it's like, so there are many lessons that we try to sort of impart, just the basic idea of like what's required for a functioning system. We have discussions of salinity and this and that and bacteria and all that, all the kinds of things. And then it's also a kind of an art and design lesson in context, right? In the context of the aquarium, these are pests abstracted from that context in a different context. They're like super cool and interesting.
Really?
So that's kind of
People could get into like aquascaping if they were so inclined.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that is what has happened. We do get the students who do have some prior experience or who do have some actual interests in aquarium keeping, and we try to foster those kids. Those are the ones that generally become my work study students, the ones who are more involved. And so this has grown into a couple of other projects. One of my current students, Mark, has an interest in marine macroalgae. Not something I really know much about. So he's done a lot of research, and he wanted to set up a bowl with macroalgae, like the cool ones you see Tiger Boy has on Instagram and whatnot. And so we gave him the resources to do that. So we have a macroalgae
Isn't this
bowl.
the guy that came down to ride with me?
No, that's Brian.
Brian's
Brian,
awesome.
Brian, who's my assistant. He's an employee, not a student, although he was a student at one point.
You'd like Mark too. Mark's pretty great.
Yeah, cool. Mark is awesome. And then Sasha, our current Reef Club president, sort of wandered in. She's a junior now, so 2 years ago she kind of wandered in out of nowhere in the middle of the semester and goes, "You guys keep any Wallstead bowls?" And I was like, where did you come from? For those, that's like a technique of keeping freshwater planted tanks. And I was like, okay, you're hired. Let's go.
Yeah.
So, and now she's president of Reef Club, but her primary interest, her dad has a very nice reef tank back in California, so she does have reef tank experience, but her primary interest is planted aquariums. And she wanted to try her hand at sort of a more rarefied nature aquarium, sort of heavily designed thing. So we gave her the resources to try an Iwagumi style planted tank that we're sort of is running here and is nice, and we're still trying to figure out all that. The sort of planted aquarium stuff, the competition level, highly designed stuff is really a natural fit for Pratt and Pratt students. It's kind of like it draws on all the stuff that they're trained to do in other contexts anyway. So we seem to be moving down that road, which is cool with me because I don't know a lot about it. So it's always interesting to learn new stuff. Yeah.
Randy, I'll tell you, there's a lot of that done in Asia and whatnot, but man, to me, I'm intimidated from that world because I look in it a lot, and it is chock full of extremely talented people.
Absolutely true.
Where they make the focal points like in the middle, and it looks like a forest. It's insane.
Okay, but that is literally what our students are trained to do
Awesome.
in different contexts. So it makes perfect sense. So they actually said to me, I don't know if this is going to happen, going back to something you alluded to earlier, is like, could we set up a big, really, really nice planted tank in the student union? They said to me. I was like, well, it makes perfect sense to me, but I can't approve a thing like that. So
but Randy, it's always logistics, right? Because as different departments want to separate out and have something over here, you have to bring them back and say like, man, that involves people schlepping water around.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll see if that goes anywhere. I had one preliminary discussion with one person who was intrigued. That way. So I don't know. We'll see. We'll see where that goes. So that's where we're at with that. Just back to the Aiptasia jar. Years ago, Matt Peterson got wind of this, asked me to write something for Coral. So I wrote a little article for Coral, and a bunch of people saw it there. And sort of this has been replicated in a few places. The science teacher in Brazil did this with a bunch of high school students. And I know Sarah Golden does it up in Binghamton with her local club with the kids mostly and whatnot. So I think it's a fun project that's easily attainable for people that deal with marine aquariums regularly. It's a really fun, good way to get kids introduced to sort of the hobby. And I think the education's pretty high, actually, in a fun way.
That's pretty great. Now we got to do a vermitid jar and a Mahano jar.
There we go. We tried Mahanos actually, and curlicue anemones. They do not do as well, I will say. Yeah.
And an acro-eating flatworm jar, and an ick jar.
Ick jar. Complete with microscope.
Yes.